Good morning, everyone. I'm Marissa Khurma. I'm the director of the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. Welcome to our second panel marking the 10th anniversary of the Arab Uprisings, which is part of the Middle East program's longtime work on democratization, political change, protests, and mass movements in a region that continues to be vital to U.S. national security interests. This is particularly important, a particularly important discussion to have as the Biden administration charts its path in the Middle East, particularly with President Biden's focus on democracy and human rights. We are very lucky to have a distinguished panel of Wilson Center Fellows and former Fellows whose work has focused on the political changes and dynamics of the Arab world, particularly since Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire in Tunisia and unleashing the first revolution that the Arab world had seen 10 years ago, calling for change and democracy. First, we'll have Marina Ottaway, who's a fellow at the Wilson Center and a longtime analyst of political transformations in Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. She's also co-author with David Ottaway of A Tale of Four Worlds, The Arab World After the Uprisings. Amy Austin Holmes is also a fellow at the Wilson Center and currently an international affairs fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her expertise is on U.S. security relations and contentious politics in Europe and the Middle East. Her most recent book delved into the revolution in Egypt. Asher Orkabi is a fellow that just joined us last fall at the Wilson Center and as an associate research scholar at Princeton University's Trans-Regional Institute. His recent book with Oxford University Press is titled What Everyone Needs to Know About Yemen, one of many areas of expertise that Asher has in the region. And Anas El-Gumati, who is the founder of the Tripoli-based Sadiq Institute, the first Libyan think tank, and a member of the Wilson Center's Africa Program Southern Voice Network. And lastly, but not least, we're truly fortunate to have Liz Sly, the Beirut bureau chief of the Washington Post, as our moderator today. Many of you probably read her work in the Washington Post and probably most recently the special series on the 10th anniversary of the Arab Uprisings. Liz spent many years not only covering the Middle East, but also Africa, South Asia, and China. So has a very impressive journalistic career, and we're very lucky to have you with us today, Liz. But before I turn it to you, I'd like to remind everyone who's listening and watching to submit your questions to us via Twitter to @WilsonCenterMEP, or you can email us to mep@wilsoncenter.org. Liz, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you for that nice introduction. And thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting this event, this very timely event, looking at the Arab uprisings 10 years on. We're not calling it the Arab Spring here because there are some obvious reasons for that was something of a misnomer even at the time. The outcomes did not justify calling this an Arab Spring. It didn't result in good outcomes. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that this was a moment of immense enthusiasm and immense hope for the region. And it's a region that hasn't had a lot of reasons to hope for a very long time. It makes it all the more tragic that it actually turned into a huge disaster. Wars in Yemen and Syria and Libya, immense suffering on a scale not seen in the region in decades. It's turned into probably the bloodiest decade in the Arab world, perhaps since the Second World War. And yes, these outcomes have caused immense human suffering across the region. And it's really, really hard to see the Arab Spring as anything other than an unmitigated disaster. Meanwhile, we see all across the region, region-wide, even in the countries that didn't go to war, the big picture issues that drove those uprisings, they haven't gone away. And in fact, they've got worse. Economies are stagnant. There aren't jobs. There aren't opportunities. Corruption remains rampant, and that's a source of huge resentment amongst the ordinary people who did take to the streets, who, if you remember, were also calling for justice as much as they were calling for democracy. And, you know, that's still as bad as ever. And corruption fuels and causes economic stagnation. Meanwhile, oppression has got worse. People were unhappy at governments that didn't allow free expression and locked people up. Those governments have now locked up tens of thousands of more people in these past few years than was the case a decade ago. And meanwhile, the region is also a very young region. It's still got a surplus of young people. Birth rates are falling, but at least for another decade, they're going to continue to rise, and millions of more people are going to be entering into the job market without opportunities because economies aren't growing fast enough to create jobs for these people. So on the face of it, it's a recipe for more disaster. So on the one hand, we've seen that these frustrations can lead to unrest. On the other hand, the chaos that we've seen in Libya and Syria and Yemen and the immense amount of oppression has dampened the appetite for change and democracy among so many of the young people we've talked to in the region. They're like, it's just not worth trying to campaign for change. You just get locked up, people lose their lives. So it's a really tough question to answer. Was the Arab Spring a failure and is it over? Or was this the beginning of a process that's going to lead to eventually perhaps long-term change? Does more instability lie ahead? I think in this discussion, we'd like to try and look ahead and see what the decade after the Arab Spring uprisings is going to bring us, what lies ahead for this region. So with that, I'm going to start out by asking each of our panelists a targeted question about their area of expertise and what's happened in this decade since the Arab Spring and what they see lying ahead. And then hopefully we can broaden the discussion a little bit to look at the bigger issues facing the region and the questions that apply universally across the region to the extent that you can make generalizations about this complicated region. So I'm going to start with Marina Ottaway, because the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, and it's the first country that had demonstrations, and it successfully toppled its dictator. And something like a democracy did emerge from that. It's the only country in the region that did see a democracy emerge. And yet there's still an immense amount of frustration on the streets of Tunisia. We've seen more demonstrations. Democracy does not seem to have brought about the kind of good governments that would lead to economic growth and opportunities for Tunisia. So what does lie ahead in Tunisia? Is its democracy stable and durable? Is it going to last? And what does that situation in Tunisia say about the prognosis for the region? Marina?
Yeah, I think, first of all, let me start out by saying I don't agree that the Arab Spring was an unmitigated disaster. I totally agree that there have been very bad consequences in many countries, but I think that one outcome of the Arab Spring that really has set in motion a process of change everywhere. And that's probably as good as we could have expected it to be. The idea that there could somehow be an instant transformation, never made any sense to begin with. Democratic transitions have always been slow. All sorts of political transitions have been slow. But let me go back to the case of Tunisia altogether. I think what the case of Tunisia shows is the weakness of democracy in countries that have enormous need for change on all sorts of fronts. The big problem of Tunisia now is that its economy is in shambles. Unemployment rates are as high as or if not higher than they have ever been. The economy is giving no sign of reviving. There are no investments coming because European countries that invest in North Africa are going to Morocco rather than Tunisia because Morocco is perceived as being more stable. So the democratic system just is not designed to address situation of that sort. Tunisia cannot carry out economic reforms that are badly needed because there are too many parties, there is too much competition, the prime minister keeps, the cabinet keeps on falling, and the parties are squabbling among themselves. And that is not because democracy has failed, but it's because, unfortunately, that's the nature of democracy. You could argue that, yes, if the political system had been designed a bit more carefully so as to prevent the proliferation of political parties, maybe. But I think the problem here is that democracy is bound to disappoint people that wanted instant change, no matter what, because it's a slow process. Now, I will not go into the details. There are problems with Tunisian democracy, with the return of many of people close to the older regime in the new regime and so on. But the main point, but that's normal, because you are not going, I think people have to decide whether what they want a revolution that tosses out everybody who was there before, and revolutions are not particularly nice processes, or whether you want a democratic process which is based on compromise and tolerating things that are less than perfect. So yes, Tunisia has a lot of problems. It's not out of the sticks. It's not impossible that we'll see another popular uprising. Once in a while, there are outbursts. A lot of it depends on what the labor unions do, because they have a lot of say on the outcome of any uprising. So it's certainly not a country that's going to sail, in a happy future at this point, but it certainly has undergone a lot of change.
So thank you. Yes, and next I'm going to turn to Amy, who's going to talk about Egypt. And yes, I mean, the sort of assumption, the consensus about Egypt is that the iron fist rule of Sisi has tamped down any appetite for change, for democracy among Egyptians, and that Egypt is finished. The uprisings there are over. It's all settled again. Is that the case? I mean, do you see any other scenario emerging out of what the situation in Egypt right now? Or is there going to be like 3 decades of Sisi rule like we had 3 decades of Mubarak rule?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. And thank you for organizing this event. Look, I think a lot depends, to be honest, not just on what Egyptians do in Egypt, but also on the Egyptian diaspora, which is growing larger day by day as more and more Egyptians leave the country. But it also depends on what the United States, the European Union, the African Union, the IMF, what these external actors do. And I believe before we could provide or chastise Egyptians for their mistakes or what maybe they did wrong during the period of revolution, or what was at that point called the transition, we have to look at how did we in the United States, what mistakes did we make? Did we actually did we actually promote policies that were supportive for the transition? And there are 3 examples where I would say we fell short in the United States and in the West. The first clear example is after the 2013 coup and the removal of Morsi. We did not uphold our own values and even apply our own laws, which would have required us to immediately suspend military aid to Egypt. We did not do that after the coup in July 2013. We waited until after the Rabaa massacre, and then a review began of military aid later in the fall. So that's one example of where we in the United States did not actually uphold our own commitment to the rule of law and civilian control of the military. The African Union expelled Egypt back then. And so if the African Union had, was able to uphold their own values about civilian control of the military, the United States and the European Union could have as well, but we failed to do so. Second, the IMF recently disbursed $5.2 billion in a loan to Egypt, which will not promote structural reform of the Egyptian economy, but which will be used to reward those who are still loyal to Sisi. And this, the control of the Egyptian military and security forces control of the economy. And the IMF does not actually demand the same level of accountability from Egypt as they do from other countries which receive IMF loans. And finally, a third example is that the American University in Cairo, where I was a professor for almost a decade, does not do enough to uphold academic freedom in Egypt. And it is a university accredited in the United States, required to uphold academic freedom, and has the ability to promote and defend academic freedom to a greater extent than public universities in Egypt, which are much more controlled by the regime. And so although the American University in Cairo has the institutional autonomy from the regime to exercise and truly promote and defend academic freedom and free speech, they do not always use that autonomy that they have. And so these are three examples where I would just ask that we first should actually look inward at what we did wrong and whether we are ready to actually uphold these values and perhaps steer Egypt, try to steer Egypt in a different direction moving forward, which I'm now with the new Biden administration, it looks like, the promotion of democracy may once again become a priority, which it was not, frankly, for the Trump administration.
Thank you, Amy. And now I'm going to move to Anna Scramati with a question about Libya. It's quite hard to me to see past the war in Libya to anything to do with democracy, or even to remember that this did begin with demands for democracy. But I remember being in Tripoli at the very, very beginning of the protests, and the enthusiasm was so immense. People thought they were going to have freedom and be like Europe, and everybody was so excited. I'd be interested to know, because I know you're there on the ground a lot in Libya and everything, has that appetite for change and democracy and freedom survived the wars that have taken place since then, or are people just too cowed and tired to care? And is there any chance that any kind of good democracy will emerge out of this mess that we've seen in Libya?
Thank you, Liz, for the question. And again, thank you to the Wilson Center for kindly hosting us today. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one that I've been mulling over, obviously, in the time that we've prepared for this talk. And I have to say, on a personal note, just a reflection of the last decade, it's sad. I mean, on a very personal note, it's sad to see, as you described in the early days of 2011, what has kind of unraveled over the past decade. And in the last week of trying to mark the 17th of February revolution in Libya, I was struggling to ask myself whether this was an obituary or a love letter, because there was so much promise in the early days, and it just seems like it's been squashed. But I would say that there have been some tremendous changes in the first place, and I think one has to remember the environment that was left in 2011. I don't think, and to chime in with my other two distinguished kind of colleagues that have just spoken as well, I don't think that this was a foregone conclusion. In as much as people remember, Gaddafi's Jamahiriya, was the most peculiar kind of state, and its overthrow and its unraveling meant that there were no institutions in the state. And so democracy required more than just popular protests to usher in this new chapter. But having said that, so did authoritarianism. This isn't Egypt. There wasn't, a military institution, a very peculiar military institution that was left behind in the wake of the overthrow of Mubarak. There wasn't a neutral military, a subservient military, in the way in which there was in Tunisia. I think Saif al-Islam in his first speech, almost a decade ago and a day ago, he said, Libya laysa Tunis wa Masr. Libya is not Tunisia and Egypt. And he was right. Libya was this kind of very peculiar kind of body. And with that in mind, the sheer effort that it required to build democracy was not only the only challenge. The very reason that we have this challenge today, and the way we've had these civil wars, is that authoritarianism required sort of brick and mortar. It required a lot of effort. And I think those efforts that were put in the early days of 2014, because it's not been a decade of civil war in Libya. There was a peaceful transition of power between the anti-Gaddafi opposition, the National Transitional Council in 2011, to the General National Congress, Libya's first elected parliament and government, in 2012. You know, we had subsequent municipal elections, local elections across the country that, yes, they were marred by moments of violence, but it was not, Libyans would not have described the events of 2011, 12, 13, and early 14 as a civil war. It was the, you know, it was this peculiar transition moment after the fall of Mohammed Morsi in Egypt that began this kind of domino effect across the region, where authoritarianism really kind of grew some teeth. We can't wrench Libya from its context. We can't wrench it not only from its regional context, but, you know, remember there are other authoritarian powers in the world, Russia, also China, that grew teeth in the last decade as well. And they've demonstrated the difficulties not only in places like Syria, but also at the UN Security Council and its ability to shape the transition in Libya. So I think we kind of miss sometimes when we zoom in too closely, we kind of lose sight of how the unraveling took place. And whilst it's very sad when one looks at Egypt, it was almost inevitable to a certain degree that the deep state that was there was going to be reactivated in moments. It took, you know, there was a smoke and mirrors effect, I would assume, in the moments of June 30th and early July. But in Libya, it took months and years of planning and ambivalence that from the community, turning away and turning a blind eye as things got worse. So I think, you know, there's a lot of regrets, I think. And I think this correctly, it does, sorry, as life has become difficult for many across the world, this is, you know, it's kind of ripened people towards a more populist mentality in the West and in Europe. The very same thing can be said about Libya. I would give you kind of very brief examples. There are things like the degradation of all the socioeconomic services under the earth.
Anas, you seem to
Water,
be breaking up a little bit.
Sorry.
Is he breaking up for everybody else? Yes. So Anas, let's move on to the next question and hope that your connection comes back a bit better soon. You've frozen for now. I'm going to move on to, or maybe it's better if you speak without video, because you might get more bandwidth that way. But in any case, I will move on to Asha Okabi for now, who's going to talk briefly about Yemen. And again, it's very, very hard to see past the terrible war. Yemen seemed to be such an inspiring example at the beginning, and it's turned into the most terrible regional tragedy with so many deaths and so much suffering going on. And in Yemen, we see a situation where international interference and regional rivalries just seem to have trumped anything anything to do with what the people may have wanted originally. I'd be interested to know what you think is the best case scenario for an outcome to this war. What is Yemen going to look like in the future? And yeah, is there any hope that anything better will emerge from this?
I'm an internal optimist, Liz, so I'm happy to provide some optimism on Yemen. And that optimism can be seen really through its history. So Yemen, the current state founded in 1962, had decades of revolutionary generation who really were the core of that leadership. And the last member of this revolutionary movement was Ali Abdullah Saleh, the last president who, at least according to his biography, was very much part of this revolutionary war during the 1960s. So an entire generation dies off and is not replaced by a second revolutionary generation. And that's what this entire conflict was really about. When the Arab Spring began in Yemen and ultimately led to the ouster of Ali Abdullah Saleh, it was the population calling out for a new revolutionary generation, some new change that would give legitimacy to this republic. The absence of political authority, though, led to a situation where there were layers of multi-layers of conflict. Right, there was a regional conflict between North and South. Yemen's unification in 1990 between North and South was actually very tenuous. And Saleh's removal from power and the absence of central authority demonstrated this very clearly. And there were also political tensions. The northern tribesmen, today part of the Houthi movement, who've suffered from decades of political and economic marginalization. And this last element is also the religious element, where in 1960s, the Yemeni state began an effort of state-mandated religious principles, diluting much of the old cultural and religious history of Yemen. And then the Zaidi Shi'i revivalist movement in the north is culminated in this Houthi political and religious movement. So all these three layers of conflict after the collapse of Saleh's regime are only revealed after the central authorities have been removed from the country, to the point where, yes, there were moments of optimism, certainly in 2011 and 12, as you said, Liz, but I think those moments of optimism have really given way to a multitude of different political actors. Each political group is claiming to be the inheritor and protector of the Arab Spring Revolution, where the revolution itself has become this amorphous idea that everyone claims to be part of, but nobody's actually acting upon. There's a debate over its ownership. Is it a revolution owned by the exiled government in Riyadh? Is it a revolution owned by southern separatists? Or is it the Houthi rebels or even the youth in exile that's owning this revolution? So I think that to point to the Arab Revolution is a moment of optimism, which then led to a moment of decline, I think would not take in that long historical view of both the death of an old generation of Yemenis, but also the fact that under Saleh, Yemen never prepared for the second generation. It was both a lack of political development, a lack of civil society, a lack of just public infrastructure, which was overrun by corruption, general mismanagement, and a prioritization of political power over public good. So the optimism that I have is this is, it was a great line said by a Soviet correspondent in 1968, Pavel Demchenko, who after 6 years of civil war said, only now do we realize that this conflict was never about Arab kingdoms versus monarchies versus republics. It was never about US and the Soviet Union. It was all about, this is just how Yemen transitions power. And eventually, Yemenis in the world will come to a realization that this is not a conflict about Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's not just the revolution that toppled the regime, but this is really Yemenis crying out through the revolution for a regime change. And sometimes that regime change takes a long time, and the Yemen of the future will not be the united Yemen of the past. But I think there is a degree of optimism that if we look at through the historical lens, that Yemen will emerge from this as a far stronger, far different state, but one that's far stronger for the next generation of revolutionaries.
Thank you, Asher. So yes, I want to kind of open the floor up a bit to some general discussion here. And Marina touched on this, and so did you, Asher, there. That yes, it's very easy to look back at everything that went wrong with the Arab Spring. But what did go right? Were there positives? It can't have been an overwhelming negative experience. What has the region learned? Have people learned from this? What will last into the future that could make positive differences in the future? And I'd like to ask Anas to kick it off, because we cut you off before, and I gather you're back with cell phone data. So Anas, maybe you could start that off, but others weigh in if you, with the positives that you do see that emerge from this seeming unmitigated disaster.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of pick up on that question, I think one has to also look back, at some of the crimes, the horrors of the regime in Libya, or the former Gaddafi regime, to understand how far we've come. And I think one has to also look at the context of the last decade. There were two springs in Libya, or there were two uprisings, 2011 and the last civil war, that also brought civilians that had fought in 2011. Many of them took up arms again in 2019. So Libya is that kind of peculiar case where, you have had these two kind of political lightning rod moments that brought people back to the streets to protest to fight and to stop the return of authoritarian rule. And I'll kick it off almost with an anecdote. I mean, you know, I spoke to a friend of mine very recently, and I said, "What do you remember from the last decade?" And he said, "Well, I remember the decade before it, and the decade before that. And I remember in the 90s, you know, one of his friends, he said his father was kidnapped, and you don't know what you know, you don't know your father's been kidnapped until he just doesn't come home. So they waited and they waited, and then they went to the police station the day after, and they said, you know, my father's missing, and the police officer said, is it political? Because if it is, don't bother asking about him anymore." That was Gaddafi's Libya. You know, people have experienced authoritarianism across the world and across the region in very peculiar ways. And for Libyans, when I discuss with my friends and with colleagues of mine, they have anecdotes. They remember what this felt like. They remember what it was like, and they're not and you know, for a lot of them, they're not going to return to that. And I think some of the major positives have been, you know, just despite all of the anguish, despite all of the things that have gone wrong, that firmness over a decade, almost over 8 years between 2011 and 19, many Libyans said, irrespective of what the stable and strong and stable kind of authoritarian offering is, we don't want to return to it. And I think there has to be, you know, there has to be something positive there to look for over the next decade, because there's also a young generation that believes that didn't experience Gaddafi in the same way, but they're also saying to themselves, I don't want to go back to this. I'm not being hoodwinked into believing that this, with all the complexity of the world, with COVID and with, you know, with the economies in the way that they are, with a young generation with multiple demands, that you're going to find old people. And it always is the old, there are no young authoritarians in the world. You know, Gaddafi was 27 when he took power. There are no 27-year-old aspiring authoritarians. They're all in their late 70s or 80s. And I think it's also that generational aspect that they're out of touch with many of the younger generation. 2/3 of Libya's population are under the age of 30. So I think there is something that is being missed there, because they're also not part of the conversation. But when the conversation turns towards action, they're the ones that take root in the street. So I think we're still part of a long, long conversation. And there are many, many things there that I take optimism from.
Well, yes, that's a very interesting perspective. Important to remember what went before. But how does that apply to Egypt, Amy? Because actually all the numbers and experiences suggest that Egypt's going through exactly that kind of thing now, and that the society is more oppressive than it was under Mubarak, or is that not the case? And what positives have been learned from the Egypt experience? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Sure. So I think that the memory of what happened in 2011 and 2012, and also in the subsequent years, will not be forgotten. And just the mere memory of what was possible, that it was possible to bring down this dictator who'd been in power for 30 years, Mubarak, it continues to inspire people in Egypt and around the world, actually. So that's the first thing. And also the fact that I think that as was pointed out by other speakers, the youth dimension of this, you know, what's happening not just in Libya, Yemen, but also in Egypt, is also incredibly important to keep in mind. I think there was a tendency to too quickly sort of blame Egyptian liberals for supporting the military as sort of the reason why everything failed or turned out as badly as it has. But they are, you know, that often neglects the younger generation of Egyptian liberals who actually did not support the return to power of the military. In fact, if you know, people like Mohammed al-Baradei, Hamdin Sabahi, Amr Musa, this older generation that were the leaders of the National Salvation Front, that were more inclined to support the military back in 2013, you have a whole generation of people, you know, 40, 50 years younger than them, that saw things very differently. And yet I think their perspectives are still not, I mean, people outside Egypt, I think, still do not fully appreciate that generational difference within the secular or the liberal opposition, if you want to call it that. So that is, you know, and just to give one example, one further example of a positive outcome, the Nubian minority actually has managed to wrest concessions even under the Sisi regime. So after 2013, a new constitution was written in 2014, and due to the activism of the Nubian minority, which has been marginalized for decades in Egypt, since the time of Nasser, when they were forcibly displaced multiple times from their villages along the Nile due to the building of dams. Nubia was essentially submerged under the waters of Lake Nasser. In 2014, due to the activism of Nubian activists, they were actually able to achieve recognition in the 2014 Egyptian constitution of Nubia. So the word Nubia appears in the Egyptian constitution of 2014, which prior to that was not the case. And some of their historic grievances were recognized, and they were actually granted the right to return to some of the land from which they were forcibly displaced. So this is just one example of how even in this repressive environment that Egypt is now in, even then it is possible to achieve some small concessions, and the Nubian minority is one good example of that.
So Ashley, you talked about the reasons for democracy in the reasons for optimism in Yemen, and you're a Yemen optimist, but you also look at the Gulf and the GCC countries. Has positive change emerged over the past decade there? It seems that what Anna said is not the case in Libya, that you don't have a young generation of dictators. In the Gulf, you do have a young generation of dictators. It seems that's pretty much stuck in its ways for a long time to come.
There was a great quote from, forgetting which Saudi official had come to the Kennedy School and spoke. And I had the audacity to ask him at the time, this was 2010, so what keeps you up at night? What's your greatest nightmare? And he said it's not one nightmare, but it's 29 million nightmares, and they're called Yemenis. And what he meant by that in further extrapolation is that the greatest nightmare for the Gulf monarchies is this massive public uprising and protest, because by nature, they run an exclusionary political system run by these young dictators in their early 30s running this new government. So there is certainly an extent where Saudi Arabia and the 6 countries of the GCC are far different. And they're over the past 10 years, what we've seen is the 6 countries may have had their differences, and certainly with Qatar, but they've been unified in their concern for this danger of public protest, and also in their newfound desire to exercise political muscle abroad, and certainly in their foreign policy, and also in their domestic policies, domestically putting down protests and trying to placate their local population with economic niceties. And abroad, both in Yemen and Syria and elsewhere, exercising both military and financial might in order to protect the kingdoms and protect the GCC from what they saw as the 29 million nightmares coming across the border and destabilizing the kingdom. So the GCC in this capacity has also caused a great deal of destruction. And in Yemen in particular, the GCC organized Salah's abdication in 2011 and 12, and has also been at the center of starting this entire conflict in Yemen. The GCC has pulled the revolution away from Yemenis, has pulled this concept of a revolution, has taken autonomy away from the Yemenis and given it instead to the entrenched political actors. The tribal actors. So the idea of the GCC expanding is a reaction in some ways to the Arab Spring protests, is a defensive. They've used their political and military might in order to exercise it, to create a degree of security and authority as a response to those initial protests in 2010 and 2011.
Marina, you spoke about, you disagree that the Arab Spring is an unmitigated disaster. You see many positives having emerged from it. Leaving aside Tunisia, which you talked about, what are the positives that you see for the region that have emerged out of this? And this is just a quick reminder, everybody can submit questions by tweeting at Wilson Center MEP or an email to mep@wilsoncenter.org. Marina.
Okay, what I see is the beginning of a process of change. I don't see anything particular. We could talk a little about Morocco, but Morocco is complicated. Let's leave it aside for the time being. But it's not that I see really positive outcomes now. What I see is the beginning of a process that was bound to be messy, that was bound to be difficult, that was bound to have setbacks, but yet has been set into motion. We were talking about the Gulf countries. Asher was talking about the Gulf countries where not much seems to be happening. The Arab countries are the Gulf countries, yes, they are trying to stop the change everywhere else. They are financing, quote unquote, the counter-revolution everywhere. They are scared to death of their own citizens. It's funny that Asher talked about the conversation with the Saudi official, asking him what kept him awake at night. I must have had the same conversation with a different Saudi official, and his answer was all those students that, this was a few years back before the Arab Spring, all those students that are studying in the United States and will come back to this country with different ideas. And there were tens of thousands of them. In other words, there are a lot, and even more now after the Arab Spring, there are a lot of governments all around the area that know that the change is coming. They have no idea how to manage the change. Second point that I'd like to make quickly, again, I'd like to pick up from something that Asher said when he said, nobody realized when or expected when Ali Abdullah Saleh was removed, that the mess that was behind there. He was, the authoritarian regime was keeping the country together one way or another. And as soon as he went, the place blew up. That is what always happened. The Yugoslavia blew up with the first democratic election they held, because what had held the country together was the Communist Party. You remove the Communist Party and the Balkans went through civil war, and that was a very nasty thing. So the problem with Arab countries is that the removal of the authoritarian regimes showed that that the building blocks of democracy were not there. There were weak political parties. Yes, there were people who wanted democracy, but that does not mean that they were organized to bring it about. And it's not accidental that the only country where things really took a positive turn was Tunisia, that had trade unions that were sort of really strongly embedded in the country. It was a real organization that could compete with the people in power. In most of the rest of the Arab country, there are no such organization. And as a result, the process is bound to be very messy and very lengthy. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about the positive outcome. All I'm saying is that what we are seeing is what was inevitable, given the character of many of these countries that were held together by authoritarian regimes and nothing else.
So, yes, of course. Asher, go ahead.
Marina, I wonder regarding Tunisia and why it was different. Do you think that the homogeneity of Tunisian society led to its success post-Arab Spring? The reason it's the poster child, and in Egypt or Yemen, which has a very fractured society, was not able to succeed. Do you think that's one of the main reasons? I mean, yes, it was the trade unions, but do you think it's just a matter of Tunisia's size and its population?
I don't know. The size, I don't know. I think maybe smaller countries, are a bit easier to manage. But what is different in Tunisia? And I think there are two things. One is that the society is homogeneous. There is not, there are no, the Berber minority is really very small and not particularly mobilized. They are all Sunni Muslim, there are 3 Shias in the entire country. So that essentially, and that certainly did help. But the other side is that although socially they were homogeneous, politically, it was a very pluralistic society because you had these ideologies and these organizations that had been in existence for many, many years, and they were not going to be eradicated by anybody. The Tunisian labor union were started by the communist-oriented French labor unions back, in the days of colonialism, and they have survived under a series of authoritarian regimes pretty much intact. In other words, at the very top, they made compromises, but the general orientation of the union never changed, and it was very solidly organized. And the other element of pluralism in the society was the hold that Ennahda had on the population. In other words, the Islamists were also very solidly embedded. And so this created a difficult balance, but it created a balance of sorts between the different groups in the society. And unless you have countervailing forces, unless you have groups balancing each other, you are not going to have a transition to democracy. In Egypt, there was no, there were the Islamists, there was the Muslim Brothers, but there was no other force that in the society that could counterbalance the Muslim Brotherhood, because the so-called the secular parties all jumped in were so scared of the Muslim Brothers that jumped in the arms of the military, so that there is no other countervailing force. And that is the difficulty now of the of sort of democratic transitions in Arab countries. Either that there is too much social pluralism, that is, there is sectarianism, there are ethnic divisions. Take Iraq, it's a good example. The Sunni and the Shias, the Kurds and the Muslims, and and that's how the political spectrum splinters. Or you have too much of social pluralism and not enough political pluralism that's really solidly embedded in the society.
So Marissa, I want to, you have a question. Weigh in, please.
Yes, thank you to all of you for your analysis. I wanted to inject sort of a question based on the introductory remarks that Marina kicked off with, which is that we have seen new dynamics of change in the region, and it's too soon to basically call it off and say, okay, well, this didn't work, these uprisings were a failure. So I want to sort of invite the panelists to give us more concrete examples of those new dynamics of change, and one in particular with regards to some of the strategies and tactics that many groups have started to get creative with in order to mobilize and organize. And what are we seeing beyond just protests, vis-a-vis unemployment, vis-a-vis corruption, or against unemployment, against corruption, or particular political events that happen. We've seen an invigoration of activity with the professional associations, for example, and labor unions. Tunisia has a long, rich history with that, of course, but I'd be very curious to see, well, what are we seeing that is new and sort of empowered by those new dynamics of change that have emerged since the first revolution in Tunisia?
Should I try to, okay. I think what we have seen is new tactics being used by the protesters. If you take the second generation of protest, right, the one that started in the last couple of years, I think they have been much more aware And I think the two cases that I'll use is Sudan and Algeria. Algeria just celebrated its 2nd anniversary, and people came back to the streets, by the way. And what the Algerians figured out is that if they had to sustain the protest, they had to make it possible for people to protest and still have a life. Because usually if you just what happened in Egypt, at some point people had to go back to work, right? And what the Algerians did, they routinized the protest. And that went on until COVID struck. That is, I can't remember the days of the week, but the big protest was on a Friday for everybody, and only protested on Fridays. The rest of the week, they went back to work. Students only protested on Tuesdays, or whichever day of the week was, so that they could still attend their lessons and go to and take exams and so on. And that made it sustainable. And week after week after week, you had these huge crowds turning out, but then the rest of the week was quiet, so that people could go about. So that was an awareness that certainly the Egyptians did not have, and the Tunisians did not have when they just took to the streets. So, and in the case of Sudan, there was, and that was perhaps the most important, was the awareness that they had to organize. That is, that just marching in the street was not enough, that they had to create a political force that could negotiate with the government. And they did. I don't think that's an experience that other countries necessarily can replicate, because because Sudan had organizations that could form this political force. They had played an important role before in the history of Sudan. I'm not going to try to go into details, but for example, the professional syndicates, not the labor unions as such, it's not an industrial country, but the professional syndicates, the lawyers' organization, the doctors' organization, had historically played very important roles, and they came out and they organized, and I think they understood the importance of organization. One of the weaknesses of the protest movement in Arab countries is that the youth reject organization, reject hierarchies. They don't want to have formal leadership. Well, it's very admirable, ideologically, but it's not a recipe for success. So to me, these are some of it.
Not a very practical. I remember meeting a young Syrian, and I pointed out to him that this leaderless, there's a leaderless revolution. They were very proud that there was a leaderless revolution. And he said, we don't want leaders. We had leaders for 40 years. So whatever we have in the future, we're not going to have leaders. And that's not very practical in the long term. And it did turn out to be a weakness. So I'm going to go on to a question from the audience. The first question comes from Anne Barnard of the New York Times. Hello, Anne. She asks along similar lines. What do you think the rest of the world, including people in the US and Europe, can learn from the Arab revolts? Lessons learned, tools pioneered, or examples set by the efforts of people in the Middle East to organize for better lives and to find new channels for politics when the old ones are blocked or dysfunctional. Asha, let me ask you if you'd like to answer that.
So yeah, I'll answer that. And in answering that, also jump back to Marina's earlier point, in that what role did revolutionaries, what role did youth play in the past 10 years? And I'll argue that in fact, they were not leaderless. And that's, I think, the main takeaway is that leadership is something that needs to be defined for each generation. And does leader mean someone stands in the center of a million protesters and makes a speech? Is that a leader? Or is a leader someone who starts a small civil society organization or NGO and has a far greater impact on the ground? Or even in Al-Nas's case, where we have the great privilege of having a think tank, the Libyan think tank sitting here, rather than a think tank in DC telling the Libyans what to think, is Anas is able to conceptualize those ideas. And that's, I think, the greatest takeaway that the United States and the European Union can take, is that Yemenis, Egyptians, Tunisians are quite capable of their own leadership, certainly on a small scale and even a larger scale, and that there's no need for that foreign intervention in a way. The dialogue conferences don't need to be dominated by the United Nations or by foreign powers, but certainly are things that can be driven by local actors who have that agency. And that oftentimes a lot of the UN efforts, in particular in Yemen, have bordered on almost cultural imperialism, trying to force a certain vision of what Yemen should be. But in reality, Yemenis are very talented and educated around the world, and especially the Yemeni diaspora, the Libyan diaspora, the Tunisian diaspora have all come together in many ways. As Amy had said, the Egyptian diaspora has a great deal of talent to bring to the fore. So the lesson that can be taken is look at the revolutions of 2010 and 11, the ability to amass that amount of public voice that can certainly be taken into the new decade, where that public voice can be crafted in a way to create a new Middle East and new countries surrounded by that very talented and vociferous youth.
So we have here another question from the audience. This is from Laurel Bradley, of Management Systems International. She's asking a question about women. In many of the countries that had Arab Springs, women and young women in particular played important roles. That we've also seen women's rights and safety threatened, but even so, women's activism continues nonetheless. What has the Arab Spring done for women's rights? Has it spurred women to step up and play a bigger role in politics than they did in the region before? Amy, I think Egypt's a good place to look at that from, but also more broadly from in the region as a whole. What did it do for women's rights?
Sure. So in Egypt, you had the emergence of, particularly because there were women that were assaulted actually during the mass protests on Tahrir Square. Women began, and their male comrades who were supporting them, began to form their own independent, essentially bodyguard initiatives. So one of the groups was called Tahrir Bodyguards. Another one was called Op Ant-ish, against sexual harassment. And so they started to do this because the Egyptian police was simply not intervening to help when assaults were taking place in broad daylight during a mass protest, for example. And so that's one example where I think women have taken the initiative to basically essentially not just protect women during these mass protests, but to also essentially organize their own kind of groups that protect women, similar to the Lagan Shabeya or the organizations that were created to protect neighborhoods during the mass protests when the police had essentially disappeared. So that's one example. I think elsewhere in the region, if we look at Syria, for example, you've had in the northeast, where you have essentially now a semi-autonomous region since mid-2012 that has developed a local administration. They also have established a gender quota of 40% in their local governing bodies. So from the neighborhood level all the way up to the highest level of their self-administration, which controls about 1/3 of Syria now. And so that's another example of quite radical and remarkable advances in women's rights that have been made. Although the Syrian conflict obviously continues and is nowhere, the situation in the regime-held territories is very different. In the Idlib or the Turkish-held territories in the northwest are also very different. But this is just one example of how, even in the midst of an ongoing conflict that is far from being resolved, there have been advances in women's rights in both Egypt and Syria.
And also, I think one of the things we've seen is purely from a demographic point of view. Certainly in Syria, but I'd be interested to know if it's true in Yemen and Libya as well. Just having men go to war and die has pushed women into the workplace. It's forced them to take more assertive roles. They were as much enthusiastic embraces of the calls for democracy and change, and they did come out, form groups, campaign for their own voices to be heard, and we do hear more voices of women being heard and them stepping up to take roles in society than was the case before. It's a small sort of positive maybe out of the horrible negative of terrible wars. Has that happened in Libya, Anas?
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I don't want to speak on the behalf of so many of the great women that have, pushed on and spurred not only the revolution going forward, but it's small political progress since. So I'll keep my comments short on this point. But number one, it was women that sparked the revolution in Libya. In fact, 2 days before February 17th, it was women outside the courthouse in Benghazi who had been campaigning for years, in fact, on that date, to try to get back their sons and their husbands and brothers from the political prison, and to understand what had happened under Gaddafi in 1996 when he had killed 1,200 political prisoners in Abu Slim prison in Tripoli. So it was women that sparked and led the revolution. And in fact, there have been many instances in Libya's last decade where they have been potentially the only beacon of light in terms of the political progress. I'll give a final example, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, which just took root in the last several months to essentially create a new executive and a new government in Libya, the government of national unity. The one, I would say the only, in fact, in my view, positive that came out of that was a push to ensure that 30% of the cabinet must be women. I mean, that's not enough, clearly, but it's a major, major step in Libya. And it's one of the only beacons, I think, that we can see. But I would also say that they have made radical change in the labor market and in the labor force in Libya. I mean, Marissa's own work at the Middle East program at the Wilson Center has shown how in Libya and elsewhere in the region, women are behind the force and behind the paraphernalia of all of this war talk and clashing with guns. It's women that are really leading the progressive movements in Libya and elsewhere in the region.
Well, thank you. Yes, yes, it is very encouraging to think about how far women have come. And they played a big part in starting Egypt as well, because it was women who started the April 6 movement with the little demonstration they held in Mahala a few years before 2011. And the men got scared and didn't come. And the women marched around the factory floor shouting, "We are the women, where are the men?" And that's one of my favorite stories that I've ever covered. And that was the beginning of the small spark of the very beginning of the Egyptian revolution. I'm going to move on to a question from Herman Cohen, retired US ambassador. He asks, is it accurate to say that that the Muslim Brotherhood, even when elected democratically, poses a threat to the middle class? Marina, maybe you'd like to take that on.
Yes, not necessarily. Let me put it this way: unless the Islamic parties, the Islamic parties that are not an armed organization, but ones that are trying to play through the political system, unless they are admitted into the political system as regular parties, there is not going to be any progress towards democracy, because you cannot eliminate a political force that has a lot of support and move to and pretend that you have a democratic process if you just rule them out. In fact, one of the most positive things that happened in countries in Tunisia and in Morocco as well during as a result of these uprisings is that Islamist groups are now part of the political system. And if you ask people, and I have done that both in Tunisia and in Morocco, asking people, what about Ennahda? What about the Party for Justice and Development, which is the Islamist party in Morocco? And people shrug and they say they are parties like all others. And I think that is very important. Are they a threat to the middle class? First of all, Muslim Brotherhood is a rather middle class organization. It's not a radical organization. It's not an organization of the dispossessed. It's not an organization of the elite, certainly. It's very much a middle class organization. It does pose a threat to people who occupied positions of power before, because they are trying to gain some of those positions of power. The Muslim Brothers in Egypt was extreme. The Morsi government was extremely, clumsy. They really did not know what they were doing. But I will not paint the entire organization with that brush. There are something that people probably don't know, that even before 2011, there were 7 Arab countries where there were Islamist groups, and mostly they were vaguely affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, that were participating in the political process in their own countries. And when I was at Carnegie Endowment, we did organize a series of meetings with the representatives of these parties. And there were 7 countries where the Islamists were represented in the government, or at least in the parliament, and they did not suffer dire consequences as a result.
So, Amy, I wanted to ask you a bit about the Muslim Brotherhood and the role in Egypt as well. I mean, it looks like they've kind of gone away. Have they been discredited, or do they still have the huge latent support that they once did have?
So I wanted to just respond to this question about whether they actually represented a threat to, in Egypt. I think people forget that during, Morsi was obviously elected from the Muslim Brotherhood. He was only in power for 1 year, but for the first 6 months of that year, there was actually a large degree of cooperation between the Muslim Brotherhood and, for example, the Egyptian business elite and the military, the SCAF. And people tend to forget that because of what happened after that. But during those first, basically half of the year that he was in power, there was actually cooperation between the Muslim Brotherhood and various other segments of society. And the Brotherhood, for example, was asking some of the Egyptian business tycoons who had fled the country in 2011 because they feared prosecution because of the corruption charges. Instead of prosecuting those corrupt businessmen, the Muslim Brotherhood actually invited them to come back to Egypt and invest in the country because they realized that they needed the economy needed to be restarted. I mean, so I discussed this in much more detail in my book, but the question of the Muslim Brotherhood is complicated. As Marina mentioned, there are Muslim Brotherhood parties all across the region. So I'm not generalizing about all of the Muslim Brotherhood everywhere in the Middle East, but in Egypt, it's very clear that the Muslim Brotherhood took a conciliatory approach and tried, I think, to actually reach out to the business elite, the Egyptian military. The Egyptian military actually was given more rights and prerogatives under the Muslim Brotherhood than they had previously had. And people tend to forget that, but I think it's worth remembering.
Yes. Do you want to weigh in here?
Yes, yeah, because I think there is an aspect of this that I think is missing, because, when we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and we even use the term Islamist, I think, we can't again wrench it out of its context. This is something that has been going on for a decade and is part of a narrative that in fact destroyed much of the Arab Spring. As part of, let's not even call it a narrative. There was dog whistling. Let's be blunt and be honest about it. The dog whistling that took place much in the Western media. I grew up in a post 9/11 world, and I remember the narratives that emerged then. But this is so much more pernicious and so much more lethal. When you use a term like Islamist to describe both a non-violent democratic party and a messianic, violent, apocalyptic party like ISIS, what are we doing? We would never say this in Europe. We wouldn't call the Christian Democratic Union in Germany. We wouldn't call them liberal Nazis. When we root ourselves in this term, imagine what's being done. If you call someone an Islamist today in many parts of the Middle East, in parts of Libya, you'll get a bullet in the head, or you'll spend the rest of your life in jail. And what do we mean when we use that term? It's also being broadened not just to include ISIS, it includes civil society members. It includes, non-violent groups, social movements. It includes anyone that poses a threat to these old elites, the deep state that has been trying to claw its way back to power. And the really sad aspect of it is, it's just an intellectually bankrupt argument. We wouldn't use it in Europe. We use it in the Middle East and in North Africa to our detriment, but it has worked. And when we look today at places like Libya, we think, how did it work? It was enabled by that kind of rhetoric that took root in Washington at Trump's time. It took root in Europe amongst populists who said, yeah, to hell with the Islamists, let these military generals come back. When you think of a region of 365 to 400 million people, and you divide it, dichotomize it between Islamists and generals, what are we saying? Is there no color? Are there no other ideas? Is there no one left? So it's such a dangerous narrative that has taken root, and it has taken root because many of the Gulf countries and Egypt, in particular Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Egypt, took this argument and went to town with it in Europe. Today, when we think of the presidential debate that is taking place now and the elections in France, and you hear members of Macron's administration claiming to Marine Le Pen that she's too soft on the Islamists, it's Islam that is the problem. It tells you how far we've gone with this. There's a problem with this debate in itself. It's beyond just a threat to the middle class. It's a threat, or is being touted as a threat to the Middle East, beyond the Middle East, to Europe and to the West. It's these kind of culture wars that are taking place and taking root. It goes back to the question that was asked earlier. So I think there's a really dangerous aspect, and we can't, like I said, we can't wrench it from its context. It's destroyed and is the part of the obituary of much of the Arab Spring.
So if I could just follow up on that, because it's a very important point you made. I mean, the narrative of the war against terror has trumped any kind of democracy promotion in the Middle East for more than a decade, for 2 decades. And, it really has led a lot of places astray on just exactly as you describe. But the war on terror is tamping down now. It's not the top priority of the Pentagon, of the administration anymore. And we do have a new administration coming in that's vowed to put human rights and democracy at the top of their priority list in dealings with all countries in the world. Will that change? Is there room for that American narrative, if it fades away, to have a positive impact in the region in terms of unraveling some of that damage that's been done in the past? And is there even a role for the US at all? Whatever they say, could they be doing more to help? And is this a moment to seize, or an opportunity for a different outlook on that narrative that anybody who wants this particular point of view is terrorist? Who would like to answer that? Marina, I'm going to ask you to do that.
Okay, I think it's, I'm not sure we are going to do it right now. I'm not, in the sense that I don't think the Biden, we are talking about politics, and I don't think that the Biden administration has any particular interest at this point to take on the issue of, delisting the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. I mean, they did it with the Houthi, which was a very good thing. It would help if we did try to put some balance in our position. That is, yes, there are terrorist groups, and yes, ISIS is a very bad organization, and it has no place in the official politics of any country. And no, the Muslim Brotherhood or the political parties affiliated that derive their ideas from the Muslim Brotherhood are very different, and therefore they should be accepted. It's not an issue on the table right now, and I doubted that the Biden administration is going to have an interest in doing it. Should they? Yes, they should. And we did it in the past. I think it's not, we have to remember that the United States recognized the Morsi government. That that when Morsi was elected, first when the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi parties together won 70% of the Egyptian parliament, the United States said, these are election results. When Morsi a few months later was elected, the United States accepted, say, we were asking for democracy, we have to accept the election results. Ambassador Ann Patterson suffered because of it, because then she was accused by anti-Muslim Brotherhood Egyptians, including the military, of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. The United States never wanted the Muslim Brotherhood. to gain power, but they accepted the election results. So it's conceivable that we go back to it, but I doubt that the Biden administration will take the step at this point.
So I'm going to go to another question from the audience, and please, this is a reminder that you're welcome to submit questions to the Twitter address and the email address. And this is clearly a question for Asha from Professor Araf Al-Haj. Is it possible to mainstream democratic principles in peacemaking negotiation in Yemen? I mean, there's a broader question there, which is, you know, is there room for democracy when you're trying to make peace between factions when that might not seem like a priority?
The conversation, this question was asked my last visit to Beirut, where the Al Masira television network for the Houthis is in the same building as Hezbollah's network, and it's run by many of the same staff, etc. And I remarked to both the Houthi and Hezbollah representatives in this meeting, and I said, if only you can create Hezbollah out of Houthis. And what I meant by that was, if only if you can create a lot of this tribal fervor and political unrest in the north, and turn it from a militia into a political group, then this conflict can be solved far more easily. And that's really the challenge, is how do you turn a violent conflict into something that can be solved through democratic or political means. And by doing that is creating the ability for groups, northern tribesmen and tribal leaders to express their views through political parties and through political means. So yeah, sure, that's the ideal. Whether it's a democracy based on even in the United States, the democratic model is flawed and criticized. So what model of democracy are you going to use in Yemen or in any of the countries under conflict now that could potentially produce a result? I think the key is finding a way to exercise opinions and voices without the force of arms.
And is there room for democracy in negotiations in finding a settlement to Libya?
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I mean, this question for me goes back to the heart of the entire question of the Arab Spring, because it's about, let's not think of just the personalities and the groups that are in the room. This is about structures. And I think today, Libya gives you a really interesting example, because it's this global war. We've just published at the Sadek Institute a paper called The Great Game, with 12 chapters on the countries that shaped Libya over the past decade, to the point where we're in these deep negotiations now. But they were drawn to Libya not only for its economic resources and not only for geopolitical influence, but also as a result of the ideological issues, the state in itself. And I would say Libya presents this example of two irreconcilable visions of the state. There is one vision of the state, which is that there is a civilian presidency and a subservient military underneath it. And then on the other hand, you have an idea or a vision of a military that has taken hold of the highest position in the state, this highest civilian position in the state, the presidency, and confirms and takes grip of the entire state apparatus. In Libya, if you don't settle that question, and that's where the negotiations are today, remove ourselves from the paraphernalia of elections and those things. If you have a presidency that controls, a military that controls your presidency, you don't have a democracy. And I think today, when we have a situation where you have individuals like Khalifa Haftar, this military general that has launched several coups over the space of half a century and continues to play a role in the political life of Libyans, and could be sanctioned by countries like the US without having to go through a broken and fractured P5, then you could try and get the platform to then build the paraphernalia and get the democratic culture going on its course. But you can't click your fingers and wag a magic wand and imagine that it will happen through a couple of negotiations or an elite bargain. There are no handshakes in Geneva that are going to make this work. You have to get the structures right. And unless you have countries that help you ensure that the passage and the custodianship towards democracy is stable, the structures are right, then you're never going to get it. So there's still a role, actually, when you think of this, for the international community in Libya. And it's sending the right signals to their international allies, like Egypt, like the UAE, like France, for example, but also their opponents like Russia, who have also been drawn to Libya, and making sure that you can inoculate Libya from, and including Turkey, by the way, as well, who have also thrown their weight around over the last several years. If you can inoculate Libya from all the foreign interference, then you can try and get them ripened towards a solution where they don't turn to bullets every 10 seconds. So I think that's where I think about in terms of the negotiations. There are these gaping elephants in the room. If we don't answer them, then Libya doesn't stand a chance.
And in Egypt, yes, I mean, the control of the military is there. How do you create institutions ever that could ever bring about a slightly different system of governance when the military plays such a big role?
Right, and this is where I would just preface this by saying, you know, if we look at the current sort of situation that we're in, we're talking about 10 years of the revolutions. If we look back historically at the period of the 1950s and 60s, when you also had a wave of uprisings across the region that began in 1952 in Egypt, really with the overthrow of King Farouk at the time of Nasser and the free officers. That period lasted really until 1969 in Libya. We think of that as one protest wave, actually. So scholars talk about this as the Arab nationalist revolutions, et cetera, at the time. So I'm just saying this because it's possible that the current wave that we're in will also last another 10 years. I mean, so that's why it's actually very important that we think about this, you know, that we use this opportunity now at the 10-year anniversary, but also with the new Biden administration, to think not just about the past, but also about the future. And that will require being very honest with ourselves and the mistakes that we made. You know, I began my comments by giving the examples of how we made mistakes in the past in Egypt. We need to also rethink our perhaps assumption that just because, for example, Sisi spent 1 year at the US Army War College in Pennsylvania, you know, there's been an assumption for years that because Egyptian military officers are trained in the United States and come here and spend a year here, that they will go back to Egypt and then somehow, you know, promote democracy, or at least the idea of civilian control of the military. And clearly, that did not happen with Sisi, and that you know, that hasn't happened with all of the other Egyptian officers that have come to the United States for as part of this program. That's just one example. You know, back also in 2011, 2012, there was an assumption that the SCAF, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, although they were unelected and entirely composed of the military, that somehow they would lead the transition to democracy. Maybe because we thought, you know, we have some leverage with them because, again, of this training program. But again, clearly that was a failed assumption. And so I really think we have to ask ourselves very tough questions in the United States now with the Biden administration. And we have to shift out of autopilot mode, because I really think US policy towards Egypt has kind of been in autopilot mode for decades now. And it's time to change that.
So yes, we're nearly reaching the end of this. In wrapping up, I want to ask each of you to give, like, just in 1 minute, 2 minutes maximum, a verdict. Is the Arab Spring over? Are the Arab uprisings over? Or is this just a long process ahead, part of a process? Asha, you start.
So I think that the Arab Spring was a big change that has now led to 10 years of gradual change, where the former revolutionaries have formed their own civil society organizations, their own humanitarian organizations, that's slowly building up a new era of civil society. So there won't be, there's no need for another Arab Spring. The voice has already been heard. Now it's a question of what those revolutionaries can do with that voice, and what kind of new Middle East can be crafted from these smaller organizations that will ultimately make up a much larger state.
Anas, your verdict.
There's so much. There's so much more in this. I think we're looking at decades. I think there'll be incremental positive changes. I think we need, you know, I think the one thing that we'll need to change, and one thing that's still up for grabs, is whether or not, you know, the gradual decline of America in the region, whether or not it reasserts itself and fills that vacuum up before a new reimagined Arab order takes root. I think if that question has been answered, then I think we can get an idea of what the trajectory looks like. But I think there's still much more left in this. And I would say finally that actually the Arab population, with the examples that were given earlier on by Marina, in Sudan, in Algeria, including in Iraq, and also Lebanon, that people are still willing to take to the streets, bloodied, battered, even fatigue-ridden, but they're still going on. So I think there is still this flicker and flame of democracy in the region, but someone will extinguish it unless policies are made quite clear and positions are made quite clear by superpowers like the US.
Marina, quick verdict.
I think we are still at the beginning of a process of change, which will take a long time before the region stabilizes again. I don't know whether it will stabilize in a series of democratic countries. I don't think, unfortunately, democracy is, the end result of any process of change. But I think the unrest is going to continue. People are going to continue sporadically to march into the street. The question is whether they are going to succeed in creating more durable political forces that can come to the table and really bring about, for more permanent change.
And Amy, your verdict.
Well, as I said before, I think it's not over. I think we are just at the beginning or in the middle of this longer term phase of transformation of the region. I think that also the current levels of repression in Egypt are really unsustainable. And I do hope that the United States and the Biden administration will reassess our policies towards Egypt. I hope also, of course, that the Sisi regime will recognize that Egypt will not develop to its best potential if they imprison the best and brightest of their own people, which is sadly what is happening. Just as one example, Mahinu al-Masri is someone I've known for over 10 years. She's been in prison now 4 times. She's in her early mid-30s and she's a human rights lawyer. She won an award back in 2014, I believe. That's the same award that Nelson Mandela won for her activism as a human rights lawyer in Egypt. And she's in prison now for the 4th time. And so by imprisoning lawyers and NGO activists, civil society activists, and a whole spectrum of people, Egypt is really thwarting its own potential to develop. And this is something that I hope there will be a realization that you need the creative energies and potentials of the young people of Egypt in order for Egypt to develop economically, politically, and in order for that to happen, there needs to be a release of political prisoners.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been so interesting, and you've given me lots of ideas for stories and themes to look at going forward. So I hope we can all be in touch again. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Marissa, who's going to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you very much, Marissa, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks to all the panelists for your thoughtful interventions and analysis. I think, as Liz mentioned, you've given us a lot of food for thought, important considerations in unpacking all these different changes that the region is witnessing, important considerations for policymakers in Washington and beyond. And I wanted to particularly also thank Liz for her time to chair this panel and navigate this conversation and move it forward. So thank you, Liz, very much. We hope to see you and host you in person as soon as we all get vaccinated very soon and are able to travel. Thanks to all of you for listening in and watching, and please follow us for upcoming events on this very topic, on protests and mass movements in the region in the next few months, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.